Good day. As there was a relative absence of news from the Ukrainian battlefronts over the last 24 hours, I'm going to start this program by discussing the big story yesterday, which is, of course, the decision of the International Criminal Court in The Hague to issue arrest warrants against two Russian officials, one of whom, of course, was none other than President Putin, the president of Russia himself. Now, this is actually, I suspect, a more complex story than is known. What I would say about it is this. There's been rumours for some months now of attempts by the Western powers to bring some kind of war crimes charges against Putin. This goes back, as I said, several months, and to my knowledge, and according to my recollection from media articles, this was also confirmed, there was discussion amongst the Western powers of getting the United Nations to set up some kind of special war crimes court to try the alleged war crimes in Ukraine. This was a fairly widely discussed idea, apparently, last year. And what drove these ideas was, of course, the fact that in the early weeks of the Russian advance into Ukraine, a large majority of countries at the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, voted against, to condemn the Russian advance into Ukraine. The terms of that condemnation were perhaps rather less vigorous than the Western powers perhaps hoped, but nonetheless there did seem to be a general consensus in the international community, or if you like, the global community, that the Russians should not have advanced into Ukraine and that their doing so was wrong. So, the problem the Western powers had when they started floating the idea of a war crimes court, I believe this actually started to gain traction over the second half of 2022, was that as the weeks and months of the conflict persisted, international opinion changed. And whereas at the beginning of the conflict, in February and March of last year, most countries were quite critical of what the Russians had done, by the autumn, hostility, opposition to Russia had drained away, and there was increasing amounts of criticism of the Western powers. And gradually, the idea of setting up a standalone war crimes tribunal faded. There was never any possibility that the United Nations Security Council would agree to set up such a tribunal, because Russia would, of course, have vetoed the proposal, and China would almost certainly also have voted against it. And it became increasingly clear that there was no support for this idea amongst the non-aligned countries in the General Assembly. So gradually, that idea faded. I remember, however, that there was, again, some suggestions that the International Criminal Court in The Hague might be persuaded or might become involved in some kind of war crimes actions, some kind of prosecutions of Russian officials involved or alleged to be involved in war crimes in Ukraine. And again, there were problems because Russia and Ukraine are not members of the Rome Statute, which is the founding document which set up the International Criminal Court. Ukraine has accepted the court's jurisdiction in certain respects, but it has actually not joined the actual jurisdiction of the court entirely. It takes what you might call a kind of a la carte approach to the Rome Statute and to the International Criminal Court. It works with it, when it suits Ukraine, and it doesn't work with it at other times. Russia is not involved at all, nor, by the way, is China, and nor, of course, is the United States. And perhaps before I proceed, I think I'm going to say something now about the United States, which is that, of course, the United States not only does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, but it has actually formally stated that if any of its people are arrested and brought before the International Criminal Court on charges, the United States reserves the right to use military force to liberate them, and the United States has also given warnings that any country that cooperates with any arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court, which involve US citizens, will also find itself the target of the wrath of the United States. That statement, that position of the United States was made, I believe, back in the time of the George W. Bush administration, and of course the US has never pulled back from it. So, the major powers, Russia, China, the United States, do not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Now, it is sometimes said that because the International Criminal Court is a UN body, the UN Security Council can refer a country to the International Criminal Court which is not a party to the Rome Convention. But of course, again, Russia would veto any resolution of the UN Security Council that purported to refer it to the International Criminal Court, and that idea is an absolute non-starter. Now, again, I have heard rumours, and these are just rumours, and I'm not able to confirm them, that at the most recent meeting of the General Assembly at the UN, again, some Western officials floated the idea of a referral of Russia by the UN General Assembly, not, notice, the UN Security Council, to the International Criminal Court. Certainly, Russian diplomats who were present at the UN and who were obviously participated in the General Assembly discussions vigorously in advance of the General Assembly meeting, criticised these moves, publicly criticised these moves by the Western powers. They said that the General Assembly had no jurisdiction to refer any country that was not party to the Rome Convention to the International Criminal Court. I remember reading on TASS a whole succession of statements by Russian diplomats, including Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Nebenzia. They were all coming out and they were saying very clearly that any such move would have no legal basis. Anyway, a few weeks ago, there was a meeting of the General Assembly. It did pass a token resolution critical of Russia and demanding that Russian forces be withdrawn from Ukraine. But there was no reference there to any referral of Russia to the International Criminal Court. And once more, I get the impression that there was simply no support for this amongst the majority of states at the UN General Assembly. In fact, I'm told that the lack of enthusiasm at the General Assembly was so profound for any kind of resolution concerning Ukraine that the Western powers were forced to water down their proposed resolution even further. They not only had to drop any ideas of a referral of Russia to the International Criminal Court, they also had to drop references that they had wanted to include in the draft resolution, the final resolution, to a purported peace plan proposed by President Zelensky of Ukraine, which peace plan essentially amounted to a demand for Russia's unconditional surrender. Anyway, the General Assembly, there was not enough support for it in the General Assembly. The Western powers began to worry that any resolution that contained references to Zelensky's peace plan would lose support. It might gain a majority, but the majority would be significantly diminished from those of previous General Assembly resolutions critical of Russia because of the over the conflict in Ukraine. So apparently, without even informing Ukraine or telling Zelensky himself, the Western powers dropped the reference to Zelensky's peace plan in the resolution. So there we go. We have had no move in the United Nations to have any kind of referral of Russia to the International Criminal Court. So what has happened since then? Well, someone, and I'm going to guess that this someone is someone in Britain, because this is a story that has been very heavily pushed in the British media, particularly the Guardian newspaper, apparently is not prepared to give up, and there's been heavy lobbying of the International Criminal Court by Britain, I'm guessing, and by Ukraine definitely. And despite the fact that there has been no referral of Russia to the International Criminal Court, much less a specific war crimes tribunal set up to try Russian officials over alleged war crimes in Ukraine. Nonetheless, yesterday, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant of Putin and, as I said, of one other Russian official. I have to say, I am very, very skeptical, to put it mildly, about the legality of this move. I think most people would agree about this, most people who've studied the Rome Statute. I do not see how a court like this can issue an arrest warrant of the president of a country that has never accepted its jurisdiction. I am choosing my words extremely carefully. I think this is well understood why all these moves at the UN to get some kind of referral of Russia to the International Criminal Court. If officials at that court and in the West had been confident that that was not needed, but as we have seen on so many occasions, over so many matters in the last few years, simple issues of legal procedure, of legal process, of due process, are no longer allowed to stand in the way when a demand to do something of this nature appears. We've seen that happen with the sanctions, the freezing of the Russian central bank's assets. We've seen that with many of the other sanctions that have been imposed upon Russia. Countries And governments that are prepared to take steps like this are not going to balk at pressuring or asking the International Criminal Court to issue arrest warrants, even if the court has no jurisdiction in the case. And by the way, this isn't the first time this has happened. I remember that over the course of the Yukos Khodorkovsky proceedings, this is proceedings involving a notorious Russian oligarch who incredibly became a public figure and human rights champion, or so he was seen to be, perceived to be in the West. I remember there was a whole succession of cases involving Mr. Khodorkovsky and his company Yukos at the European Court of Human Rights, and I remember that all those decisions started to stack up against Mr. Khodorkovsky, and the result was that at some point a decision was made to bring a completely new case in an entirely different court, the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which is a largely moribund court which was revised for that purpose. The Russians, again, had never acknowledged the jurisdiction of that court over the specific statute that was being cited, the EU's third energy package, to be precise. But that court nonetheless decided that they would steam ahead and try the case, and unsurprisingly, they published a judgment which was in every respect contradictory to the judgments that the European Court of Human Rights had previously made. So we see this before, we see this happen on previous occasions, and this is nothing new. Why do courts do this? Well, maybe some of the judges really do feel that they have a personal duty to pursue these sorts of cases. One mustn't never ignore that factor. Some of them may have particular biases as well. Judges do have biases. Of that, there is no question. Every individual does. So do I. And, however, there is the further factor as well, the factor that goes beyond this, which is that judges who sit in these international tribunals know that the Western powers want them to make these sort of decisions. And I'm sorry to say, I think that in some cases, some judges worry that if they don't make these decisions, there might be career consequences for themselves. The last is not something I know for a fact, but I've heard it said to me, and I'm afraid I've come to believe that it is true. Anyway, there we go. We have an arrest warrant issued by a court over someone over whom it has no jurisdiction. To my mind, this is not an actual bona fide legal move. It is essentially an act of rhetoric. Nothing more. No one seriously expects that Mr. Putin or the other Russian official is going to be arrested. Nobody really believes this. Nobody thinks that this is going to change anything at all. Global opinion will not look favourably on this move. In Africa specifically, the International Criminal Court has become increasingly unpopular because of the feeling that it particularly picks on Africans and has become, to some extent, an instrument of Western policy and disregards the far more egregious violations of the Western powers. In that respect, perhaps it's worth remembering that we are now at the 20th anniversary of the US and British invasion of Iraq in 2003. That invasion of Iraq, it's now widely accepted, universally accepted, was made on false premises. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, as alleged by the US and British governments. It was also made illegally because it was not approved of by the UN Security Council, and of course it resulted in enormous amounts of death and destruction and violence in Iraq, and of course there were confirmed cases of torture at Abu Ghraib, the prison in Iraq where the US was holding prisoners, and yet there have been no war crimes charges brought against any of the senior officials involved. None of the political leaders, none of the military officers, no one at all. And of course around the world, that fact is widely understood, and this latest move by the International Criminal Court will be construed, as I think it should be, as an act of lawfare. Now, saying all of this, I want to make it very clear I am not familiar and cannot be familiar because the International Criminal Court has not published the arrest warrants. We only know that they exist. I'm not necessarily saying that there isn't some kind of a case to answer by the Russians. The case, to the extent that we know, supposedly involves the alleged abduction by the Russians of children from the Donbass. The Russians, of course, claim that all legal proprieties were followed, appropriate consents from parents were obtained. Some of these children, of course, were parentless and held in orphanages, and that all that happened was that these children were evacuated from a war zone and taken to Russia, where they would be safe and where they could be placed with foster parents. And that's what the Russians say. I understand that there is a long discussion of this whole issue by the Associated Press, which I have not seen, but which apparently takes issue with these Russian claims. The International Criminal Court says that abduction of children, removal of civilian populations from a war zone is a war crime. I'm going to say straight away that it seems to me that there is a fundamental conceptual premise behind these arrest warrants which might make them at least open to challenge from a Russian point of view. Because the International Criminal Court, like the Western powers and most countries in the world, continue to consider Donbass, where these children were taken from, as occupied Ukrainian territory and treats these children as Ukrainian. Of course, under Russian law, Donbass is part of Russia, and these children are not Ukrainians, but Russians, and Donbass is not territory occupied by Russia, it is territory partially occupied by Ukraine. Now, I accept most countries around the world don't accept that, but that may change in time. In fact, I suspect that quite possibly at some point it will. In which case, as I said, the whole legal premise behind this arrest warrant will collapse, and we will find ourselves in a position that what is called abduction and deportation, forced deportation, comes to be seen again, perhaps rightly, as a proper evacuation of children at risk in a war zone. Again, I want to stress I'm choosing my words extremely carefully for the reasons I hope you all know. Anyway, regardless of that, there have been far more egregious war crimes committed than this one. There's no suggestion, as far as I'm aware, that any of these children have come to harm, and I'm not convinced that there's been, as I said, forced deportations of these children. Besides, I would add that there is a very elaborate international legal processes relating to the protection of children and relating to the abduction of children. To my knowledge, Russia is a party to some of these legal statutes and international agreements. If some of these children had been removed against the consent of their parents, I would have thought that their parents would be in a position to bring legal action, civil legal action, to have their children returned to them. And of course, the Russian courts, which would partly have to adjudicate on these matters, might not be partial. But I would have thought that before a court like the International Criminal Court became involved, the civil courts ought to have had a say, should have had their say, should have been given at least a chance to have their say, given that this kind of arrest warrant immediately politicizes this issue in a way which I don't think is in the interests of the children. Anyway, I would going to finish by reiterating again that this is a piece of rhetoric. Most of the world is not going to be at all impressed by this move. It's going to damage further the reputation around the world of the International Criminal Court. Outside the West, it's going to further confirm that the court is simply an instrument of Western power, a view which has already, as I said, gained quite a lot of traction in quite a few places. It will be seen, in other words, as an act of Western lawfare rather than as the impartial administration of justice. In the meantime, I have to point out to the really rather odd comments of the President of the United States. Mr. Biden says that while he thinks that the decision of the court is justified, he also reiterates that the United States does not recognize the court at all. As far as the United States is concerned, this court, as I understand it, does not even exist. So you feel that the move of something you don't recognize and whose existence you perhaps don't recognize is justified. I'm not going to try to unravel that particular exercise in logic. Anyway, there we go. That's where we are. Let me reiterate again, this is a rhetorical move. It's not going to have any effect on Putin's ability to lead Russia. It's not going to result in being brought before the court in The Hague to face charges there. It would require a political revolution in Russia for that to happen, and of that there is no sign. It's going to consolidate support for Putin in Russia. In fact, if you read the Russian media, you can see that all over the Russian media today, pretty much every newspaper, every commentary is enormously hostile to this decision. It's going to make Putin appear an even more courageous and heroic figure than he has been up to now, and it will reinforce the belief the vast majority of Russians now have that the West is trying to carry out regime change in their country. And in the meantime, it's not going to obstruct or stand in the way of Russian diplomatic contacts with countries friendly to Russia, like India and China, or prevent Putin traveling to these countries, though it will, of course, make it impossible for Putin to travel to Western Europe, where I suspect he has no intention of ever going anyway. I'm going to finish by making one further quick observation. Way back at the time of the G20 meeting in Indonesia, Putin decided that he would not attend in person. He sent, I think, Lavrov to represent him instead. I said on a program that I made at the time that I was fairly sure that one reason why Putin decided not to go, in fact the key reason why Putin decided not to go, was because of the possibility that the Western powers would try to arrest him. Not in Indonesia itself, but perhaps in transit. Well, we see that opinion that I had then, even if it might not have been true at that time, has become true today. As I said, fundamentally, it changes nothing. It makes no difference to the course of the war. It may make diplomatic contacts between Russia and the Western powers more difficult, but there it is. That's, I suspect, going to be, going forward, more a problem for the Western powers than it is for the Russians. Anyway, that's my view of this strange affair. As I said, an arrest warrant issued by a court over an individual over whom it has no jurisdiction. But there we are. I have to say, I suspected that at some point something like this would happen. Let's return to the events on the ground, and then let's discuss the diplomatic situation, because there's some big moves coming with Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, which is due to begin on Monday. Let's first of all start with the military situation on the ground. Now, as I said, there's been very little news over the last couple of hours. There's been a major drone attack, Uranium-2 drone attack across Ukraine. I haven't been able to obtain a great many details about it. I'm not certain what its purpose is. No doubt we'll be getting more information later. There's not so far been a follow-up missile attack, but it's plausible that such an attack may be coming. But then I suspect also the Russians like to keep the Ukrainians on their toes. And anyway, we'll have to wait and see how that shapes out. A Russian official, and I think it was Denis Pushilin, has now said that the Russians control 70% of Bakhmut. And I reckon that this is about right. Can't confirm it. And I'm not absolutely sure that it was Pushilin who said it, but I did read that, and I do think that this is probably roughly correct. Anyway, there has been comments by Pushilin, and he talks about the situation in Bakhmut. He says, "We managed to entrench in the Vostok Mash plant buildings, and now we make progress directly deeper inside the industrial area." And Pushilin added, this is all from TASS, that Russian forces continue moving towards the center of the city whilst simultaneously driving the enemy away on both northern and southern directions. And TASS reminds us that a few days before, on the 14th of March, Pushilin announced that the Russian forces would soon take control of the Vostok Mash plant. Now, there's not been very much news, as I said, of what's going on in the areas around Bakhmut. There's some suggestions today, and I think these are probably correct, that claims that the Russians have actually occupied the village of Khromovo, which is on which sits astride the road, the northern road leading into Bakhmut from Chasov Yar, that those reports were wrong. It seems more likely that what's happened is that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from Khromovo. It's a very, very small place, and the village provides little cover, but that the Russians have not occupied it, presumably because as it provides little cover, their forces would also be subject to shelling. Then there's been reports that the Russians are pressing forward with the encirclement of Avdeevka. This is this other important town near Donetsk, which, as I said previously, is the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Donetsk. And the report this time comes from Yan Gagin, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, and he's a regular commentator about the progress of the war on Russian television. He gave an interview yesterday to Rossiya 24 television station, and he said it is highly likely that Avdeevka will become a cauldron in the coming weeks because our forces are entering neighborhoods around the city. And then TASS quotes him as saying on this interview, according to Gagin, Russian forces have already taken control of several neighborhoods that are the key to taking Avdeevka. Russian aircraft and artillery are working intensely in this direction. And there's also a report that, again, this is all taken from TASS, that Russian Marines have been, naval infantry, have been making gradual progress, incremental progress in Vuhledar. Not very much confirmation of that. But there's also been claims that a reconnaissance in force carried out by Ukraine in Zaporozhye region. This is not a big Ukrainian attack in Zaporozhye region, but an attempt by Ukraine to send some troops and armoured vehicles forward, basically to test the Russian defences. That group of Ukrainian troops was spotted by the Russians and attacked by Russian artillery and driven back with heavy losses. Now, on that topic, Vladimir Rogov, who is, as I said, an official of the Russian-appointed government of Zaporozhye region, he discussed the situation in Zaporozhye, and this is, of course, the region where many people anticipate that this expected Ukrainian offensive, the spring offensive, will come. And Rogov says, I do not rule out that an offensive by Ukrainian troops may begin at the end of March or in April. When we see or hear the newspaper Politico, and you remember this is the article from Politico that I discussed a short time ago in one of my programs, in which Alex Cristoforo and I also discussed on the Duran, the Politico article spoke about a offensive in Zaporozhye region in May. Anyway, Rogov says, when we see or hear the newspaper Politico or someone else say that an offensive will be possible no earlier than May, I would question such statements for the simple reason that Western media often try to lull our vigilance, to divert our attention, to catch us off guard. While reading Western media sources, one should take into account what they say, of course, but definitely not take this for granted because it's fog of war disinformation and psychological operations. And then TASS quotes Rogov as saying that Politico did not even mention the possibility of a strike in the Zaporozhye region in the Tokmak area. Not sure what that is, by the way. It discusses only the scenario of the Ukrainian offensive bypassing Tokmak and Melitopol up to the Sea of Azov with the aim to cut the overland corridor to Crimea. So there's been a lot of articles about the Politico article in the Russian media, and this is here won by TASS, and their Russians are saying to each other, don't be lulled into a false sense of complacency. The Americans may be saying that the Ukrainian offensive will take place in May, but it could take place sooner than that, and we must be prepared. And that, I have to say, seems to me a wise precaution. Now, what about the Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut? There's still a lot of debate about this. There's still a lot of talk about Ukraine launching a counterattack in Bakhmut to break the siege there, perhaps to try and encircle the Wagner organization forces, perhaps to try to reverse the entire tide of the fighting, which has gone very badly against Ukraine in the Bakhmut area since January. Well, there's been no more news about such an offensive, and interestingly, there have been relatively few reports in the Russian media about any further Ukrainian build-up in the area. That doesn't mean that some kind of a counterattack won't come. I'm going to guess if it does come, it will probably be over the course of next week, though I understand that weather conditions are very bad. The reason why I think it will be over the course of next week is because I think if Ukraine doesn't conduct an offensive within the next week, the situation in Bakhmut will become irretrievable. The Russians will probably be able to complete capture of most of Bakhmut, perhaps even all of it, and the Ukrainian garrison in Bakhmut will probably have run out of supplies and ammunition, and its ability to conduct defenses in Bakhmut will have collapsed. By the way, yesterday, the Russians were reporting that some Ukrainian units tried again to withdraw from Bakhmut, but they were caught in the open fields by the Russian artillery, and their vehicles were destroyed, and many of the men were killed, and they had to return to Bakhmut, and that this breakout attempt, if that is what it was a failure. So, as I said, I think that the time window for such a relief attempt on Bakhmut, or perhaps a counter-encirclement, is now closing. I'm not obviously a military person, but we'll have to see what exactly it is that the Ukrainians do over the course of the next few days and hours. And as I said, I think if there's going to be a Ukrainian move, it will probably be next week. Anyway, let's now move on to diplomacy, because of course the big event that's coming is the trip of Xi Jinping to Moscow, which starts on Monday. And there's been a significant amount of commentary about it in the Chinese media. Now, the first thing I would say is that the Chinese have picked up on the fact that the United States has now come out publicly and has rejected the Chinese peace proposals over the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I want to stress again, there has never been anything as elaborate as a Chinese peace plan over the conflict in Ukraine, but the Chinese did set out certain ideas about how peace could be taken forward, and they have spoken about the need for a ceasefire. And the White House has now categorically said that they are opposed to these ideas, that a ceasefire would merely confirm Russian military gains, and it is therefore unacceptable. Unacceptable both to Ukraine, presumably, but specifically to the United States. Well, the Chinese have picked up on that, and they're running with it. They're running with the fact that the United States is now publicly opposing Chinese peace moves. And there's been a long article about this in Global Times, the newspaper, which, as I've said many times, is the newspaper, the English language newspaper, which articulates the foreign policy thinking of the Chinese government. Anyway, this is what parts of this article say. It says that the US rejecting calls for Ukraine ceasefire shows ulterior motive of fueling the fire of conflict. And the writer, who's identified as Chen Xing, goes on to say the US rejecting calls for a ceasefire in Ukraine ahead of the meeting of Chinese and Russian leaders again showed its ulterior motive of fueling the fire of conflict and using Ukraine as its pawn to geopolitically weaken Russia to the maximum level, Chinese experts said, who also pointed out the sharp contrast between Washington and Beijing, with the latter always seeking peace and dialogue on the matter. And the article then goes on to say that Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow is widely considered a journey that will advance peace, as China has been long committed to promoting peace and dialogue over the Ukraine-Russia conflict. However, the Biden administration threw mud over the trip, expressing concerns over any proposals from China and claiming any framework offered by Beijing would be one-sided and reflect only the Russian perspective. And the article then quotes Li Haidong, a professor at the Institute of International Relations at the China Foreign Affairs University, is saying the US rejects any effort that is conducive to easing the situation, as it always hopes to escalate the tension and use Ukraine as a pawn to weaken Russia. The US wants to punish Russia in a ruthless and uncompromising way. Such zero-sum mentality and winner-or-loser geopolitical games between great major powers is extremely dangerous, not only to Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, but also to the world. And then, in contrast, Xi's upcoming visit to Russia, viewed as a trip of friendship, cooperation, and peace, is expected to further promote China-Russia cooperation and contribute to global peace and development, especially after China brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran recently. Many observers raised expectations for whether China will play a crucial role in political settlement in the Ukraine crisis when Beijing has open communication channels with both countries. And then the article talks about the fact that China has good relations with both Russia and Ukraine. The Chinese foreign minister, Qin Gang, recently had, on Thursday in fact, a telephone conversation with the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba. But of course, the US doesn't want, according to Global Times at least, and its experts that it's consulted, China to fulfill a peacemaking role in the conflict. And it also quotes, the same article quotes Timofey Bordachev, a program director at the Moscow-based Valdai Club, and it quotes him saying, "The US looks at the world differently than Moscow and Beijing. For them, prosperity, that's to say for the US, prosperity depends on hegemony, and all practical policy must support this fundamental goal. Therefore, the West's most important tool is pressure, and China's and Russia's most significant tool is cooperation." Anyway, there's more of that kind in this article, but you get the general picture. China is the force for peace. the United States is the force for war. China aims to resolve conflicts. The United States seeks to stir them up and prolong them. And I'm going to say straight away that around the world, amongst most countries around the world, these comments that the Chinese are now making carry traction. The Chinese, in my opinion, have bided their time very astutely. They waited for the crisis in Ukraine to play itself out. They waited for world opinion to start to cool on the Washington, Brussels, London axis's interpretation of events in Ukraine. They waited for sentiment in the global south to harden increasingly against US policies, Western policies over Ukraine, and to become exasperated by this single-minded focus with which the Western powers have been waging this conflict in Ukraine, and by their insistence on having every country line up behind them in some kind of race to condemn Russia. The Chinese have bided their time. Now, when the pendulum is swinging against the Washington, London, Brussels axis, they're coming out and they're making what are actually extremely vague peace proposals. I doubt that they can be called, as I said, really peace proposals at all. But they do solidify the impression that China is a force for peace and that the United States is a force for conflict and war. And it is a good look for China to have, and a very bad look for the United States to find itself in. I'm not sure to what extent people in the United States understand this, whether this is understood in the State Department, I doubt it by the way, or in the various alphabet soup of intelligence agencies that exists in Washington. I think it is inconceivable that it is understood in the White House, and it probably isn't understood in Congress. But the Chinese, who've just brokered peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, are now able to project to more and more countries the image that they are the force for peace and stability. They're the country that wants other countries to prosper. They are the country that respects international law and sovereignty. And it's the United States, on the contrary, that is the major disruptor. Far from preserving the status quo, far from respecting international law through its pursuit of hegemony, it is the major cause of violence and instability in the world. And we can expect the Chinese to push this relentlessly over the next few weeks and months and years. In the meantime, the Chinese are not just doing that, but of course Xi Jinping is off to Moscow. And we've now had a long editorial about the purpose of his visit from Global Times. And as I said, this should be seen as fairly authoritative, coming as it does from Global Times. Anyway, this is some of the things that the Global Times editorial says. After the visit in 2013, it's the last time that Xi Jinping went to Russia. After the visit in 2013, once again, actually, sorry, it's the last time, that's the time, 2013 was when Xi Jinping was last elected Chinese president. His first trip then was to Russia, and the Global Times article says, after the visit in 2013, once again, Xi Jinping has made Russia the destination of his first overseas trip after being elected as Chinese president. The Russia tour will further deepen strategic mutual trust and mutually beneficial cooperation between China and Russia, which will not only benefit the two countries and their peoples, but also bring more certainty to the international community amid numerous risks. And you can see already, China forces stability, talking to Russia, securing stability, securing peace, unlike the United States, which does the opposite. It will be a trip of peace, friendship, and cooperation. Against the backdrop of the escalating Ukraine crisis and intensifying geopolitical tensions worldwide, the visit has attracted special attention from the international community and in the realm of public policy. The news, when it was released on Friday afternoon, immediately sparked extensive interpretation and analysis, with many reports focusing on what role this visit will play in promoting peace talks and negotiations in the Ukraine crisis. The expectations from the international community towards China's head of state diplomacy can be strongly felt. And then the article goes on to say that it's not actually about just Ukraine. It should be pointed out that the Chinese and Russian heads of state have maintained a deep personal friendship. They're friends. And frequent interactions. And it is customary for the leaders of the two countries to visit each other every year. The visit falls within the scope of bilateral relations between China and Russia, and the focus is on further promoting and leading the continuous high-level development of the bilateral relationship. In other words, with or without the Ukraine crisis, the leaders of China and Russia will maintain normal exchanges and interactions, with or without. This is not going to stand in the way of Chinese friendship. Fundamentally speaking, this is because the two countries have established solid political, economic, and cultural foundation, and consolidating and deepening the China-Russia relationship is the fundamental interests of the two peoples. At the same time, China and Russia both support multipolarity and the democratization of international relations. In other words, they are against the global dominance that the United States has exercised and continues to exercise over the international system. And they say that, and the editorial says that, democratization of international relations, which is also a universal aspiration shared by the international community. So Global South, we are on your side. In the current complex and turbulent international situation, China and Russia have greater space for deepening their cooperation, while the significance of China-Russia friendship becomes even more prominent. The strong complementarity of the two countries' economic structures creates tremendous potential for cooperation in the fields of energy, industry, technology, and human resources. During Xi's visit to Russia, the two leaders will exchange in-depth views on practical cooperation of common concerns, including deepening the synergy between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian Economic Union, and jointly maintaining the stability and smooth flow of industrial and supply chains. In other words, we're going to deepen our trade. We're going to develop it to an even higher level. Our economies complement each other. China needs Russian oil, gas, food, strategic minerals. Russia needs China's industrial support. And as for sanctions, well, we're not going to let that stand in our way, not at all. Now we come to what is perhaps the most interesting paragraph in the entire editorial. In recent years, one expression has been commonly used when it comes to China-Russian relations: non-alliance, non-confrontation, and non-targeting any third party. Now, another sentence has been added. It does not tolerate any third party's interference or coercion. These sentences are strong in their specificity. The new type of major country relations between China and Russia has provided enlightenment to the world, in stark contrast to the behavior of some countries that are keen on creating various small circles, forming cliques, and engaging in power politics. Now, this is a rather interesting paragraph, because we're told that previously, up till now, the China-Russia relationship has been a relationship of non-alliance, non-confrontation, non-targeting any third party. But now that's going to be modified. There's not going to be any acceptance, any toleration shown to interference or coercion by any third party. Any third party, of course, means the United States. Now, let's just pass that a little. It does not tolerate any third party's interference or coercion. So, interference is when the United States tries to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, in this case specifically China and Russia, or tries to create trouble between China and Russia. That's not going to be tolerated. But there is the other issue of coercion. Now, what does that mean exactly? Coercion is a very strong word, but it could be extended to mean various things. It obviously means, first and foremost, that if there are sanctions, if the United States threatens sanctions on one country in order to prevent it trading with the other country, well, the Chinese and the Russians are going to oppose that. Now, that's one obvious interpretation of the word coercion, and that is undoubtedly the right one. But coercion can also be extended to have a military meaning. After all, if the United States warns a country of military steps, if that country continues to take certain actions that the United States disapproves of, so far as the United States is, so far as the world is concerned, that is a form of coercion. So let us assume, let us theorize a little. Let us say that there is a conflict in the Taiwan Straits, and the United States comes forward and gives warnings to China about that conflict. And let's assume those warnings have a military element, as they probably would do. That looks like coercion. That could fall within the definition of coercion in this sentence, in which case it's a form of coercion against one part of this relationship between China and Russia. Now, one must be careful not to read too much into these words, and maybe the original Chinese words are milder. I'm not sure that this is a allusion to possible military support by China and Russia for each other. But I think that the use of words like coercion and the following sentence says, these sentences are strong in their specificity. Well, that does begin to suggest that some kind of, at least to me, that some sort of relationship is beginning to form, which is beginning to deepen its military aspects. After all, China and Russia regularly engage in joint exercises. There's a joint naval exercise underway at this precise time. So this is perhaps a further indicator that these exercises are beginning to develop an ever deeper meaning. And we have the points made about how this is in contrast to the various small circles forming cliques and engaging in bloc politics, which is again obviously an allusion to the United States and its friends. And then there's an awful lot more about why relations can be beneficial, and the fact that China and Russia are pursuing good relations with each other doesn't mean that they can't each pursue good relations with other countries, and what that isn't in any conceivable sense a threat to those other countries. And then it discusses Ukraine, and it starts with the rhetorical question, does China have specific actions to bring about peace and promote talks during this visit? This expectation stems from China's continued efforts to play a constructive role and ease the Ukraine crisis in its own way. And then the article says there is an obvious problem. It must be said that China is not the cause of the Ukrainian crisis, nor a party to it. It is the United States and Western countries that have got themselves deeply involved in the crisis. The key to solving the Ukraine crisis is not in China's hands, but in those of the United States and Western countries. If they continue to stir up trouble instead of cooperating, it will be unlikely that any efforts to bring about peace and promote talks will be effective. And then the article highlights the contrast with China's mediation actions over the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, and it ends with a resounding statement about how China-Russia relations have withstood the test of international turbulence and remain calm and clear-headed, always advancing in a steadfast manner and in a direction that benefits the peoples of both countries and the world. This relationship has stood the test of time and will write a weighty chapter of new type of major power relations with honesty and transparency. But let's go back to the words that were said about Ukraine. What the Chinese are saying is, look, we've set out what we think is the basis upon which peace could be achieved. We've set it all out in our position paper. We've shown how it works. We achieved it in the rapprochement. We've mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But ultimately, we cannot solve the crisis in Ukraine. That's not within our power to do, because we are not a party to this conflict and never have been, and we are not intent on prolonging the conflict. The powers that seek to prolong it and to inflame it are the United States and the Western powers. So it seems to me that this editorial is in effect saying that the Chinese are not going to engage in a major diplomatic initiative over Ukraine. They're not going to seek peace in Ukraine. They're going to position themselves always as the potential mediator if both sides agree. They will tell the world that they stand as a force for peace and stability in international relations. They will highlight the fact that they've made proposals which could be used by Russia and Ukraine as a basis to promote peace in Ukraine. The fundamental problem, however, is that the United States is not interested in peace in Ukraine because, consistent with its overall policy, it encourages conflict and war. So, what is Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow going to be about? It doesn't look to me as if it's going to be principally or even frankly at all about Ukraine. I think it's going to be about all of those other things this editorial is telling us about, deepening economic contacts, but also possibly deepening strategic contacts as well. Going back to that critical paragraph, the one that I spoke of, where there were those words about how the relationship between China and Russia is moving beyond its original formula: non-alliance, non-confrontation, and non-targeting of any third party. We now are starting to see at least glimmers that this relationship is being developed to counter threats, coercion from a third party, which of course, as we all know, is the United States. Now, yesterday I talked about the AUKUS deal. I discussed how I find this is an absolutely crazy deal from the Australian point of view. The Australians have been strong-armed into investing hundreds of billions of dollars into the US military's shipbuilding industries in order ultimately to benefit the US Navy's nuclear submarine program. And in return, they're going to get 3 Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines that the United States wants to dispose of. And going forward, they might get certain new submarines, which, however, it looks like they're going to have to share with the British. It's a terrible deal from an Australian point of view, and I'm not even looking at the geopolitical dimensions of it. Contrast that with what we're seeing between the Chinese and the Russians. These are two powers, they're not equal. China is unequivocally the more powerful country, by far. It's got the biggest industrial base in the world. Its manufacturing capacity is greater than that of the United States and Europe combined. But, as we have seen, Russia remains a significant force. It's the world's leading nuclear military power. It has powerful armed forces, as we're increasingly seeing in Ukraine. And it's got an industrial and high technology base that is not to be disregarded. And, of course, it is the world's biggest commodity producer. It provides oil, gas, strategic minerals, food in quantities that no other country can match in aggregate. So these are two very powerful countries, and they're coming together. And this is a relationship which is producing results now. Australia will get perhaps 3 old Virginia-class nuclear submarines in about 7 years, possibly. And, well, it has to wait an awful lot longer, until 2040 or even 2050, before it gets more modern nuclear submarines. And it's going to have to share those with the British. And it's going to pay through the nose for the privilege. It's going to have hundreds of millions of dollars of Australian taxpayers' money invested into the United States in order to achieve this. And in the meantime, its relationship with China has been wrecked. It's no longer going to be in a position where it's a major raw materials producer for the Chinese economy. As the Chinese economy grows and develops and evolves, that role will increasingly be filled by Russia. Whereas this relationship between China and Russia looks very different. It's much more all spectrum. As I said, they're not formally allies, but this article in the Global Times is the first Chinese hint that I know that they might be evolving towards that position. But of course, their economies are complementary and they're dovetailing with each other. Now, some will say this is Greater China, and in a way it is. As I said, I mean, the Russian economy, much bigger though it is than many people think, is still small relative to China's, though, as I said, not insignificant. But yes, China will clearly be the dominant party in this relationship. But one can't say that the Russians aren't getting an awful lot. They're getting investment, they're getting technology, they're getting industrial access, they're getting lots of things. And the Chinese are saying, if the United States tries to stand in the way, what the United States tries to interfere, well, we won't let it succeed. It seems that the AUKUS relationship is a very unequal relationship indeed to me. A terrible bargain. Whereas this relationship between the Chinese and the Russians is not only far more potent and immeasurably more consequential, but is also far more equal and mutually beneficial as well. Anyway, that's where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Just to remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and get the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Tomorrow, I suspect I'll be looking again more at the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine. There may be more going on also in the financial system. There's lots of rumblings that things there are not good. But that's for tomorrow. In the meantime, all that's left is for me to wish you all a very good day.